everyone. I just want to thank you all so much for making my debut here in Cincinnati so special, and I hope to see you guys in the next round.
Somebody standing in the corridor outside the show court in Mason, Ohio on the afternoon of August 15th, 2026, heard it before they saw it. The sound came first. A pocket of voices, not scattered, not polite, layered, rehearsed almost, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it has been waiting for weeks and is not going to waste the moment. And the flags, blue, red, white, that single golden sun stitched into the corner, held up in the walkway before the player had even stepped onto the court. And then Eala walked out, the number 17 seed at her first ever Cincinnati Open, and the noise met her before her shoes touched the paint. This is not a story about a ranking. It is not a story about a draw sheet. It is a story about a sound that has started following a 21-year-old around the American hard court swing, and about a claim that began circulating this week that would have sounded absurd 6 months ago. That in a stadium where the world number 1 was also playing that afternoon, the loudest corridor in the building belonged to a Filipina seeded 17th. Whether that comparison is literally true in decibels is not something a broadcast can measure. What we can measure is why people are even saying it. Eala arrived in Cincinnati as the WTA's world number 20, a career high she reached on August 3rd according to the official WTA rankings, the first Filipino ever to break into the top 20. She arrived 1 week after winning the Washington Open, the Mubadala DC Open, a WTA 500 title she claimed by beating the world number 3 Jessica Pegula in the final. And she arrived at Cincinnati seeded number 17 given a first-round bye, treated by the draw not as a story but as a fixture. Those are the two facts that matter before anything else in this script. Everything else, the crowd, the chants, the comparison, the noise, grows from that soil. Here is the tension, and it deserves to be stated fairly. Aryna Sabalenka is the world number 1. She is the top seed at Cincinnati. She is, by any measure, one of the 2 or 3 most magnetic figures on the WTA Tour, and her matches at every 1,000-level event draw significant invested crowds. Nobody in this story is diminishing her. Sabalenka has spoken openly about a 2026 that hasn't quite hit the standard she set last year, framing her recent results, in her own words after Toronto, in a no-stress register. She is refusing to panic, and there is no reason she should. So when fans in Filipino tennis communities began posting this week that Eala's crowd in Cincinnati felt bigger, or louder, or more coordinated than the top seeds, the reaction was not really about Sabalenka at all. The reaction was about the collision of 2 assumptions. The first assumption is that at a WTA 1000, the world number 1 always owns the acoustics of the building. The second assumption is that a debutante seeded 17th from a country that has never before produced a top 20 player does not bring her own weather system with her. Both of those assumptions were operating in Mason this week. One of them held. The other, at least on social media, cracked. And the interesting question is not who was actually louder on any given afternoon. The interesting question is why anyone was even measuring. You measure when you sense a shift, and to understand the shift, you have to look at what Eala brought into Cincinnati on her back, because none of this arrived by accident. Start with the sound itself. Video from GMA News, from ABS-CBN, from a dozen fan accounts posted in the last 48 hours, all capture the same scene. Eala walking out for her second-round match against Elena Gabriela Rus on August 15th, flags visible in the stands, chants audible through the broadcast microphones, and a crowd that had, in the reporting of one fan account, followed her again. That is the phrase people started using, not attended, followed. Because the same phenomenon showed up in Washington, it showed up in Toronto, and now it has shown up in Mason. This is not a home crowd. This is a traveling crowd, and traveling crowds are not something a 17th seed traditionally brings to a WTA 1000. The Ruse match itself ended quickly, Eala led 6-1, 3-0 when Roos retired with a right thigh issue, according to the WTA's official match record. But the score of that match is not the point. The walkout was the point, which brings us to the seeding. Alex Eala is seeded number 17 at Cincinnati. That means she received a first-round bye. That means the tournament and the ranking system that feeds the tournament treated her not as a wild-card curiosity, not as a story from a smaller country, but as a top 32 player who had earned her exemption from the opening round. That is what makes her placement in this draw quietly historic. She is not being handed a stage. She is being credited for one. And the reason she earned that credit is what she did the week before Cincinnati began. In Washington, Eala won a WTA 500 title, the Mubadala DC Open, and to do it, she beat, in order, Zheng Qinwen from a set and a breakdown, defending champion Leylah Fernandez, while trailing 1-5 in the second set, world number 2 seed Elina Svitolina in straight sets, and world number 3 Jessica Pegula in a final that ended 4-6, 6-4, 6-0. That final scoreline is the sentence that ended the debate. A 21-year-old in her first WTA 500 final, closing out a top 3 player 6-0 in a decider. That is not a hot streak. That is a resume entry. And that resume entry is what the ranking system responded to. On August 3rd, 2026, the PIFWTA rankings moved Alex Eala 8 places to a career-high number 20, the first Filipino ever inside the top 20 in the history of the WTA rankings. That is the number that put a bye next to her name in Cincinnati. That is the number that put a seeded line at number 17 next to a country flag that had never appeared in that region of a WTA 1000 draw. And that is the number that people in Filipino communities across North America seem to have taken as their signal, because from that ranking update onward, the crowds got bigger. The flags got more coordinated. The corridors got louder. It stopped being tennis fans who happened to be Filipino. It started being Filipino tennis fans, which is not the same thing at all. And any tour player who has ever walked into a stadium organized around a single figure will tell you the difference. Take a breath here, because this is where the story stops being about points and starts being about something else. What is happening around Alex Eala this month is a phenomenon that has a name in fan communities now, Eala Mania, coined on Instagram and Facebook, spreading through fan reels and shared posts. It is worth being careful with a phrase like that. It is a fan coinage, not a journalistic verdict. But when a phrase spreads that fast, in that many places, at that specific moment in a player's career, it is describing something real, even if it is not describing it precisely. Because here is the moment that gives the whole story its center of gravity. In her pre-tournament press conference at Cincinnati, transcribed and published by Tennis 365, Alex Eala was asked about going home to the Philippines earlier this summer, in the weeks before this North American swing, and she said something that most young athletes at her career stage do not say out loud. She said in her own words, "I'm quite out of touch sometimes with what my impact is back home. To experience it firsthand and to interact with the people who support me is enough to see a glimpse into their stories or how tennis has impacted their lives." Read that quote twice. She was telling reporters in the days before she walked into a Cincinnati corridor full of flags that she is still catching up to her own gravity, that the impact she has on people has at times been happening at a distance she could not fully see. And then 2 days later, she walked out of that tunnel in Mason, Ohio, and the impact was standing there waiting for her. She did not manufacture it. She did not organize it. It came to meet her because it had been building the whole time she was learning what it was. That is the ceiling of what this story can prove. Everything above that quote is verifiable. The ranking, the seed, the Washington title, the Roos scoreline, the video from the walkout, the part that is not measurable, the part the title of this video hangs on is the comparison itself. Was her crowd genuinely louder than Sabalenka's on any given day this week? Nobody has counted. No decibel meter has been produced. No neutral outlet has made that claim as fact. What has happened is that fans in Filipino tennis communities on social media began saying it, began measuring it in their own way, began sharing videos side by side. That perception is real. Whether the underlying comparison holds under laboratory conditions is not the point of this story, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The point is that the perception exists at all. The point is that a 21-year-old seeded number 17 in her Cincinnati debut is now producing the kind of atmosphere that gets compared out loud with the top seeds. That comparison is the news, not the answer to it. That is the story the tour is beginning to acknowledge as well. Amanda Anisimova, the world number 10, and Eala's third-round opponent on August 17th, was asked ahead of the match about facing her for the first time, and in comments published through WTA video content, she described Eala as incredible, noting she had not played her before. That framing matters. Anisimova is a Wimbledon finalist. She is a top 10 player. When a top 10 player uses the word incredible ahead of a match against a debutante seed, that is not a courtesy. That is a read on the room, and the read on the room extended beyond her opponent. Former U.S. Open finalist Greg Rusedski, writing for Tennis 365 this week, argued that Eala should not be intimidated by the tough Cincinnati draw she received. It's a public defense from a Grand Slam finalist that would not have been written about a 17th seed with no traveling crowd behind her. Authority figures around the tour are calibrating to something. They are calibrating to the possibility that this run, Washington, Toronto, now Cincinnati, is not a bracket, it is a trajectory. And that changes how they talk about the match on Sunday. It changes what they expect from the crowd. It changes what they expect from her. To understand what that trajectory means outside of tennis, you have to zoom out from Mason. The Philippines has never produced a WTA top 20 player before Alex Eala. There has never been a Filipino singles title on the WTA tour before her win in Washington last month. When she walks onto a court seeded 17th at a WTA 1000, she is not just representing her results, she is holding a place in a history that did not exist before her. And that is what a cultural symbol actually is. A cultural symbol is not a hashtag. It is not a fan account. A cultural symbol is a name that fills a slot in a record book that used to be empty. And every time it fills that slot, a whole population sees itself in a place it has not been before. That is why the flags are traveling. That is why the crowd is following. Because for a Filipino watching from Cebu or Queens or Toronto or Mason itself, Alex Eala's seed number is a personal document. It says, "Our country is now on this page." That is worth driving 3 hours across Ohio for. That is worth chanting for. And whether or not any afternoon this week produced a crowd that literally exceeded the top seeds is, in the end, secondary to the fact that at a WTA 1000 in 2026, that comparison is even a live question. None of which means the road stops rising, because 2 weeks before Cincinnati, Alex Eala arrived in Toronto seated, prepared, playing well, and then she went out in the round of 16. Not a catastrophe, not a wound, but a ceiling. A reminder that the WTA 1000 level asks a specific kind of question and that the answer is not always available. What made the Cincinnati story possible was what happened between Toronto and now. She went to Washington, absorbed the disappointment silently, and answered with a title inside 7 days. That is the part of her that does not show up in the crowd videos. That is the part her own presser gestured at when she said in Cincinnati this week, "There are moments where it's heavy, there are moments where it's fun, but at the end of the day, I am also aware that it's a crazy experience, so I'm just trying to take it all in." That is not the sentence of a player who thinks she has arrived. That is the sentence of a player who understands that the crowd will keep growing, and that the only way to meet it is to keep working underneath it. So here is the room she is in now. The world number one is in that room. Amanda Anisimova is in that room. Jessica Pegula, whom she beat 6-0 in a decider 3 weeks ago, is in that room. Elina Svitolina is in that room. The same locker room hallway, the same practice courts, the same seating sheet with a 2-digit number next to her name for the first time in Philippine tennis history. That is the accomplishment. Not that any crowd on any afternoon was louder than any other. That is the noise the story rides on, not the story itself. The accomplishment is that a number 17 seed, making her Cincinnati debut, walked into a corridor of flags because a country and its diaspora decided together that this was the week they showed up. On Sunday, she plays Anisimova for a place in the Cincinnati round of 16. However that match ends, the corridor will be there on Sunday too. That is the room she is in now. And if you want to be in the room when it fills again, subscribe to this channel because the US Open begins in 10 days and she will walk into New York seated for the first time in her career into a stadium where the flags have already learned the way.